Welcome again. This is MJB. I'm going to discuss with you today what we call modal auxiliary verbs. Remember, we have auxiliary verbs of different types, but I'll concentrate on the modal auxiliary verbs. We need to understand what modal auxiliary verbs are and get examples even before we look at their functions in various sentences. Now, modal auxiliary verbs. If you ask yourself what is a modal auxiliary verb, this is how we should understand that a modal auxiliary verb is a helping verb, as you all understand. It is a helping verb. And it is a verb used together with a main verb to express ability, possibility, permission, obligation, or what we call insistence. So you have to understand, first of all, that it is a helping verb. A modal auxiliary verb is a helping verb. And now what it means is that it is a verb used together with a main verb to express ability, possibility, permission, obligation, or insistence. So modal auxiliary verbs are as follows. Examples of these modal auxiliary verbs include can, could, will, good, shall, should, may, might, must, need, and ought to. Those are the examples of the modal auxiliary verbs that we're going to look at in this video. To begin with, let's understand this modal auxiliary verb that we call can. Can is a modal auxiliary verb used to indicate the following. It indicates what we call ability. When it indicates ability, we have an example in a sentence. For example, we can say, I can write well. So can in that particular sentence indicates ability. Secondly, to show an acquired knowledge or skill. For example, I can drive well. If I say I can drive well or I can drive a lorry, it means that that is an acquired knowledge or skill that is expressed in that particular sentence. Can also be used to show permission. How will it show permission? For example, can I come in? That one shows permission, that whoever that is speaking is requesting for permission to come in. Can I come in? Can also be used to show what we call possibility in a sentence. For example, we can say, any of you can serve the food. Any of you can serve the food. Can also indicates requests. How does it indicate requests? Example, in a sentence we can say, can you draw the curtains? That is a request. We should note that can and be able both express ability, and it is therefore wrong to say, I can be able to drive. It is wrong to say so. It is wrong to say, I can be able to drive. Rather, it's better to say, I can drive, or I'm able to drive. We have another modal auxiliary verb, and that is Could. Could is a modal auxiliary verb that indicates the following. First of all, it also indicates permission. How does it indicate permission? For example, an example in a sentence, we can say, could I borrow your paper? That indicates permission. Could can also be used to show a request. How does it show a request? Example in a sentence, we can say, could you please pick my dress from Ndolo's shop? Could you please pick my dress from Ndolo's shop? She requested. That shows a request. Could can also be used to indicate the possibility of something happening. It can indicate the possibility of something happening. For example, they could have lost their way to the market. Can also be used to show ability. How can it be used to show ability? For example, we can say Kipto could run both 100 and 200 meter races. That shows ability. We have another modal auxiliary verb, and that is good. Good is a modal auxiliary verb that is used in a sentence to show the following. First of all, it shows what we call the consequence of an imagined event. It can show the consequence of an imagined event. For example, if Regina worked hard, she would succeed. It can also be used to show an action or event in the past. An action or event in the past. For example, if I had called him, I would have received the information. Good can also be used to make polite requests. For example, would you mind helping me solve this problem? That is a polite request. Good can also be used with words such as like, love, prefer, or happy to express a wish. For example, I would prefer cookies to ice cream. Good can also be used after so that in order to show a purpose. It can be used after so that in order to show a purpose. For example, he hid the atlas so that Muhammad would not use it. He hid the atlas so that Muhammad would not use it. We have another modal auxiliary verb, and that is should. Should is a modal auxiliary verb used in sentences to indicate the following. First of all, it can be used to indicate what we call an obligation or to express an obligation. How does it express an obligation? Example, we can say, you should obey your parents. That is an obligation that is expressed in that particular statement. Secondly, it expresses a piece of advice or a recommendation. For example, people should not drive when under the influence of alcohol. Should can also be used when drawing a conclusion. For example, there should be no traffic jam on this road on Sunday. Should can also be used with words such as imagine, say, or think to give an opinion. For example, I should think it is the right time to go home. Another modal auxiliary verb is will. Will is a modal auxiliary verb used in sentences to show the following. First of all, it shows future prediction. Future predictions. For example, your parents will give you pocket money for next term. Secondly, it is used in describing what we call habits in the present. Describing habits in the present. For example, she will ensure you are comfortable when you visit her. Uh, will is also used to show willingness or unwillingness to do something. For example, we can say the teacher on duty will give you the letter. It is also used to show requests. For example, will you pack the food for her? Will you pack the food for her? It is also used to show what we call general truths. For example, in a sentence, we can say that oil will always float on water. That is a general truth. Another modal auxiliary verb is shall. Shall is a modal auxiliary verb used to indicate the following. First of all, it indicates what we call future predictions. For example, we shall harvest honey next week. That is a future prediction. Another use is to show people's determination and will. It is used to show people's determination and will. For example, I shall ensure that all people have clean water. Another modal auxiliary verb is may. May is a modal auxiliary verb used in the following. That is in the following ways. For example, first of all, it indicates permission. How does it indicate permission? Example, may I sit down? Hassan asked. It also indicates probability. For example, that may be the reason for his coming. It is used also in expressing a wish or hope. For example, may you have a fruitful week ahead. Another modal auxiliary verb is might. Might is a modal auxiliary verb that is used to indicate the following. First of all, it indicates permission. For example, might I have contributed to the discussion? Secondly, it is used to show possibility or likelihood. For example, he might win the long jump this year. It is also used when asking for information. For example, how long might the dentist take to remove a tooth? Another modal auxiliary verb is must. Must is a modal auxiliary verb used to indicate the following. First of all, it indicates obligation, advice, or recommendation. How does it indicate obligation, advice, or recommendation? An example is, I must get an umbrella or else I will get wet. I must get an umbrella or else I will get wet. That shows obligation, advice, or recommendation. Another use, it is used to show what we call necessity. How does it show necessity? An example in a sentence is, we must eat to live. That is a necessity. It can also be used in drawing a logical conclusion. For example, Cinder must be tired after standing for 3 hours. Another modal auxiliary verb is need. Need is a modal auxiliary verb that is used to indicate the following. First of all, it indicates obligation. How does it indicate obligation? For example, you need to register as a voter before the deadline approaches. That sentence shows obligation. Secondly, need is a modal auxiliary verb that is used with have and a past participle to indicate that actions in the past were or may have been unnecessary. For example, you needn't have cooked all the food as snacks were enough. Another modal auxiliary verb is ought to. Ought to is a modal auxiliary verb that indicates the following. First of all, it indicates obligation, advice, or recommendation. For example, you ought to eat well to be healthy. Secondly, it is used in drawing a conclusion. For example, the queue at the bank ought to be shorter by now. The queue at the bank ought to be shorter by now. We should note that must means have to, ought to, and should. However, we should note the following difference. The first difference is must is used to show that the speaker orders or expects something to be done. Secondly, have to is used. Have to is used when drawing a conclusion about something that the speaker has no doubt about. Thirdly, we must understand that ought to and should indicate that the speaker is giving an order but suggest that he or she is not sure whether the order will be obeyed. That is the difference that we have to note when it comes to have to, ought to, and should. They may look alike, they mean the same, but there is that difference that we get when we understand how they should be used. Thank you for your time. Remember to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment.